At his hands, 20 million Soviet citizens lost their lives over the course of a quarter of a century. It was with a brutal iron fist that he controlled over his enormous dominion. The use of terror was his primary strategy. When he was still alive, no one, not even the members of his family who were closest to him, was safe. And so when he passed away, his people mourned him as the savior of their people. The heartbreaking reality of Joseph Stalin is revealed in this week's Biographic, which can be seen here. Even one death is considered a tragedy. A statistic is equal to 1 million fatalities. Gori, a small village in Georgia, was the place of birth for the individual who would later be known officially as Joseph Stalin. During that historical period, Georgia was a component of the Russian Empire's imperial territory. This individual was born on the 18th of December in the year 1878. The father of Stalin was a man named Arian Saakashvili. An additional name for it was Besa. In addition to being an alcoholic, he was a shoemaker who spent a significant portion of his time away from home while creating footwear for the Russian military. His wife and son were subjected to physical abuse whenever he made an appearance at home. Although Stalin's mother, Ekaterina, was also a disciplinarian, she was generally protective of her son. She also imposed sanctions on him. Stalin did not learn how to speak Russian until he was 9 years old with the language. Over the course of his whole life, he never completely lost his distinctive Georgian accent. Stalinese. During his childhood, he was exposed to a hostile environment. The town of Gori was known for its violent atmosphere, and organized street brawling was a common activity there. On the 13th of February in the year 1892, the young Stalin was there as 2 criminals were publicly executed by hanging. The traumatic experience left the child with a deep-seated loathing for the Tsarist governance. He was enrolled in a church school where he demonstrated remarkable academic success. In addition to becoming a member of the church choir, he received praise from his instructors for his intelligence and his memory. 1894 was the year that he graduated 2 years earlier than the timetable. After that, when he was only 15 years old, he was given a scholarship to attend the theology seminary in Tiflis, which is the official capital of Georgia. On the other hand, the young man declared himself to be a Marxist and an atheist, despite the fact that he was more interested in the books of Marx and Engels than the Bible. It is the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, also known as the SDLP, that he joins. Stalin was kicked out of the seminary in 1899 due to his Marxist leanings, which eventually led to his expulsion. At this point, he had officially taken the revolutionary alias Koba, which was the name of a figure in Georgian culture that was similar to Robin Hood. During the subsequent 2 years, he was employed at the Tellus Meteorological Observatory in the capacity of a clerk. In the course of this time period, he committed himself in the organization of strikes and began writing articles for socialist newspapers. In addition to this, he became proficient at delivering revolutionary speeches. In the year 1901, he moved to the coastal town of Batumi, which is located in Georgia. On the other hand, the SDLP urged him to incite disturbance in the community. As a result of his participation in the organization of a strike at an oil refinery, he was sentenced to prison for this offense. After serving a sentence of 18 months in prison, he was transported to Siberia. The subsequent 12 years were spent by Stalin. 6 times he was taken into custody. Every time he was successful in evading capture and making his way back to the West, frequently using falsified documents to travel. During the month of February in 1913, he was taken into custody for the last time and then banished. When it comes to Siberia, Uttarakhand is the most inhospitable region. He spent a total of 4 years there. Over the course of several years, he became more set in his ways and more pessimistic. Stan Easy was Stalin's first wife, and the couple tied the knot in 1906. The following year, they welcomed their son Yakov into the world. While he was engaged instigating discontent, Stalin was frequently absent. Because of this, His wife and son did not spend much time with him. A funeral was held for Carter in December of 1987 when he was 22 years old and had died of typhus. According to Stalin, this creature has the ability to soften my stone heart. She is no longer alive, and she has passed away, the last of my affectionate feelings toward others. Although Stalin's son was raised by his in-laws, Stalin paid no attention to him. Later in his life, Stalin issued an order that led to the arrest and execution of a significant portion of his family, including her brother Alexander, who had been the one who had introduced Stalin to Carter. In the year 1911, Stalin was living in a rural Georgian village when he became a father to a son who was born to his landlady. The youngster, Konstantin, did not communicate with his father at any point in his life. Bolshevik and Menshevik groups emerged from the Sudetenland Communist Party (STLP) in 1983. Stalin was a supporter of the Bolshevik cause and was a fan of the revolutionary Vladimir Lenin's works. He also identified himself with Russia's revolutionary movement. Lenin became aware of him as a result of his activities to weaken the Mensheviks and his participation in a number of burglaries that were carried out in order to raise funds for the Bolshevik leadership. Stalin was a man who left an impression on Lenin, who referred to him as the Magnificent Georgian. A member of the Bolshevik Central Committee, he was appointed to that position in 1912. Stalin gave up his Georgian identity, Koba, and adopted the name Stalin, which means man of steel. This transformation occurred during this period of time, along with food shortages and economic difficulties. The advent of war in 1914 hastened the collapse of son Nicholas, the second ruled defeat on the Eastern Front, and the enormous loss of regions of territory in Germany. All of these factors have taken their toll on Russia's weak infrastructure. Over the subsequent 3 years, the level of intensity of protests and strikes increased. Last but not least, on March 15, 1917, the Russian parliament, known as the Duma, compelled the establishment of a provisional administration. Protests and strikes are taking place. They became more intense throughout the course of the subsequent 3 years. At long last, on March 15, 1917, the Russian parliament, known as the Duma, established a provisional administration. On the same day, Caesar Nicholas abdicated the Romanov dynasty, which had lasted for 304 years. Is this the conclusion? In the year that followed, Lenin issued an order that led to the execution of the whole Romanov family. The provisional government, which is comprised of socialists and primarily Mensheviks, is now in control of the country, due to the fact that the government required the support of the Soviets, who expressed a lack of readiness to assume complete authority. The dual power structure was essential. Stalinese. As the revolution was taking place, he continued to reside in exile in Siberia. After moving back to Petrograd, he joined the editorial staff of the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda, which literally translates to truth. He took up the position of editor. Stalin made the decision to work along with the interim administration in order to increase the support of the Bolshevik Party, which was a minority party at the time. Lenin, upon his return from his exile in Europe, derided the revolution and attacked the new administration, describing it as imperialistic and claiming that it was no better than the previous state. The fact that Stalin had a conciliatory approach toward it led to his censorship. As a consequence of this, Stalin became more adamant in his opposition not only to the government but also to other socialist parties. Protests against the provisional administration began in July of 1917 and continued throughout the year. The most prominent Bolsheviks were taken into custody, but Stalin, who was regarded as a blessed importance, was not among them. In late October, Stalin attempted to conceal Lenin and assist him in vanishing in Finland. Lenin harbors disdain for Petrograd and has advocated for an instant takeover of power. At the same time, moderates within the party recommended exercising restraint. It came as a surprise when Stalin took their side, but Lenin continued to move forward. At a conference that took place on the 23rd of October, it was decided to go ahead with an armed rebellion against the government. Petrograd was taken over by the Bolshevik Armed Wing, which was directed by Leon Trotsky, 2 days after the fall of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, the Provisional Administration was deposed. Power had been taken over by the Soviets. The new government, which was called the Council of People's Commissars, was established by Lenin. Stalin was given the position of People's Commissar of Nationalities on the occasion. There was a concerted effort being made across Russia by various factions that were hostile to Lenin's new autocracy to overthrow the Bolshevik government. At the same time as the Russian Civil War began, in addition to being given the responsibility of defending the city of Sin, Stalin was also given the position of political commissar. The location of the city that would eventually become Stalingrad is this one. The fact that Trotsky had been designated as his military superior led to frequent conflicts between the two of them. Once upon a time, he confined a group of people who supported Trotsky aboard a leaking barge and then abandoned them to drown. This was the point at which the Bolsheviks decided to change their name to the Russian Communist Party. Stalin's ascent through the ranks of this organization was remarkable, and he owed everything he accomplished to Lenin's assistance he received. Lenin appointed him to the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party's Central Committee in 1922, and he remained in that position for the remainder of his life. But within a year, Stalin and Lenin had a disagreement with each other. In the decades leading up to the revolution, the state of Georgia, which was Stalin's home state, had been promised autonomy. On the other hand, that pledge had been broken between the years 1918 and 1921. During the year 1922, it did not experience a period of self-rule. Lenin made the decision to include it back into the group. He wished for the get-together to be a tranquil get-together. Stalin, however, had differing ideas. The leaders of the Georgian insurrection were promptly put to death as a result of his harsh repression, as well as Lenin. When he reached this point, he was outraged beyond measure. In contrast, he experienced the first of a series of strokes in the latter half of 1922, which had a significant influence on his capacity to command. He criticized Stalin in the estimations that were published in November of that year. The root of the problem is Stalin. In a Secretary General, this flaw becomes unbearable and cannot be tolerated. It is for this reason that I propose that the comrades come up with a method to remove Stalin from that position and appoint another individual to take his place. After several months had passed, Lenin remained hospitalized. Stalin called his wife, whom he thought of being the source of her husband's disdain of him and who he subjected to a barrage of insults, referring to her as a syphilitic whore for the course of the conversation. Unsurprisingly, Lenin was furious upon learning about this. His reaction was one of fury. There are a lot of people who believe that Lenin's death was brought on by the tension that the situation brought about. Approximately 10 months after Lenin's passing, Stalin took the initiative to organize the funeral and participate as the principal pallbearer. He also attended the funeral. It was at this point that he began the process of elevating Lenin to the status of a god. He took use of this chance to rebrand himself as the person who would carry on Lenin's legacy, even going so far as to rename Petrograd as Leningrad Stalin. From this point on, Stalin decided to have doubts about Lenin. Trotsky and his followers, who were members of the leftist Trotskyist movement, were now Stalin's primary adversary. Trotsky was compelled to resign from his position as the People's Commissar for War by Stalin in 1925. Beginning this point forward, anyone who voiced their opposition to the Secretary General was putting their very lives in danger. The 4 members of the opposition, including Trotsky, were kicked out of the party on the occasion of the open opposition that broke out in late 1927. It was decided to banish Trotsky to Kazakhstan. Stalin tied the knot with Nadezhda, his second wife, in the year 1919. In 1921, they welcomed a son named Vasily, and in 1926, they welcomed a daughter named Svetlana. An event commemorating the 15th anniversary of the October Revolution was being held by the couple on the evening of November 8, 1932. The event was being held to mark the anniversary. They frequently argued with one another, and this particular day was no exception. Nadezhda made the accusation that two of her husbands had treated her with inconsideration. In response, he humiliated her in front of others who were present at their party. He then addressed his "Hey you" to her while flicking cigars in her direction. The deceased were discovered by the servants the following morning. Lenin had ordered the purchase of the food and livestock of the peasants, which accounted for 85% of the Soviet people, before he passed away as a result of a gunshot wound to the head during the Russian Civil War. They subsisted solely on the land. Additionally, he had issued an order for the collectivization of farms that peasants considered to be in a better life. The kulaks were to be erased from existence, put to death, or deported. The implementation of these policies resulted in widespread destruction and ultimately famine. Having come to the conclusion that he had made a mistake, Lenin came up with a new economic program in 1921 in an effort to make things better. On the other hand, Stalin made the decision to reinstate collectivization in the year 1928. In the next 5 years, he intends to accomplish this goal. Any individual who put up a fight was straightforwardly put to death. As a class of peasants were encouraged to denounce the kulaks, who were to be executed on sight, or, if they were lucky, transported to gulags in Siberia. Stalin made the announcement of the annihilation of the kulaks in December of 1929. The armed forces were dispatched by Stalin into the countryside in order to coerce the locals into forming collectives. Numerous individuals lacked any kind of information regarding agriculture. In an effort to prevent their property from falling into the hands of the state, the kulaks resorted to killing their own animals and destroying their own equipment. Following then, Ukraine was hit by a terrible famine. As many as 10 million people lost their lives in the western region. This period of time was to be regarded as the time when hunger was eradicated. Despite this, the state did not provide any assistance. In fact, anyone who was caught with even a handful of grain was subject to the death penalty as a form of punishment. Over the same period of time that these individuals were starving to death, Stalin was exporting millions of tons of grain that was desperately required. Stalin made the statement in 1931 that the Soviet Union was 100 years behind other countries in terms of technological advancement. They had 10 years to make up for lost ground, or else the rest of the world would surpass them and destroy them. In the course of his 5-year plan, new industrial cities came into being. Within the span of a decade, the Soviet Union had, in fact, outpaced all other nations in terms of the development of their industrial sector. The United States of America will be the only exception. The average Russian, on the other hand, did not feel any advantage from Stalin's achievements. The factory workers got obsessed with achieving targets that were becoming increasingly unattainable. In the event that they were unsuccessful, they were at risk of receiving the most severe punishments. The number of people living in Stalin's camps for forced labor had reached 1 million by the year 1935. Sergei Kirov, the leader of the Leningrad Party, emerged as a potential challenge to Stalin's total control during the 1934 political congress, during which the gulags were discussed. In response, Stalin went on a ferocious purge of the party, which resulted in the deaths of 1,108 people, the imprisonment of 56% of the Congress delegates, and the execution of 1/3 of them. The assassination of Sergei Kirov took place on September 1, 1934, in front of the party offices in Leningrad. An assassin, his wife, and his mother, who was 85 years old, were all put to death in a short amount of time. Stalin seized onto this assassination as the cause for the Great Terror, despite the fact that many people believe that Stalin himself was the person responsible for this assassination by himself. Because of the new statute that he introduced, the defendants were unable to mount any kind of defense. it was determined that nearly all of the show trials that took place in Moscow resulted in the execution of the defendants, beginning in 1939 and continuing through the subsequent 3 years. Stalin's purges became increasingly brutal. The process was carried out in a very thorough manner, with him writing out arrest quotas and quantities of people to be shot in each district. On the other hand, excessive fulfillment of this was encouraged. Before they too were denounced, those who were scared of being denounced were the ones who first brought their denunciations forth. This resulted in the establishment of gulags, which quickly became overcrowded and necessitated the construction of larger complexes using slave labor. There was no one who could actually sleep in peace, with the exception of Stalin himself. A significant number of individuals who held positions of authority grew scared that they, too, would be the next victims, and several of them took their own lives in an attempt to avoid their destined fate. Even the military was not exempt from the purges that were carried out. At the same time that Hitler was gaining control of Austria, Stalin was issuing orders to have his most capable military leaders put to death. After that, those who had survived developed a paranoid attitude toward one another. At the same time as Hitler was stretching his military muscles in 1939, which was pushing Europe closer and closer to war, Stalin was concerned about the safety of France. He looked to Great Britain as a possible ally, but it seemed that Britain wasn't doing much of anything at all. He was disappointed. Consequently, Stalin did not show any reluctance when Germany approached him. His signature was on the non-aggression treaty that Hitler had signed. The declaration was straightforward. It said that the people of Russia and Germany would not engage in armed conflict with one another. Stalin felt a significant amount of pressure as a result of this. Through the summer of 1940, it appeared that Hitler's enslavement of Europe was impossible to stop. His Blitzkrieg Panzer Army had pushed through Belgium, Holland, and France in a span of time that was less than 2 weeks. During this time, he started looking toward the direction of the east. Stalin, on the other hand, was unable to accept the fact that the Führer would have broken his promise. This is exactly what takes place on June 20th, 1941, based on the events that transpired. It was through the crossing of the Polish border that Nazi troops entered the Soviet Union. It came as a complete surprise to the head of the Soviet Union. Within the span of a month, German forces had arrived within 100 miles of Leningrad. The city of Smolensk was taken by the Russians on July 16th, and by June 26th, just 4 days after the battle had begun, 400,000 Soviet men had been encircled and imprisoned. On June 29, as the German pincers closed in on Minsk, a crucial bastion that was en route to Moscow, news reached Moscow claiming the city of Minsk had been taken by the Germans. There had been only 1 week since the beginning of the German invasion. If things continued as they were, the Germans anticipated arriving in Moscow within a month. At this juncture, it appeared as though Stalin had finally come to terms with the enormous magnitude of the catastrophe. Even Zhukov, the stoic chief of the army, was moved to tears by his fury, which he directed against his generals. Then, however, Stalin fell apart, and he grinds. "Everything is gone forever. I am giving up. It was Lenin who established our state, and we have messed it up." His daughter was located on the outskirts of Moscow, and Stalin was driven there. In a state of amazement, he sat down in his arms. In his absence, he did not show up at the Kremlin the following day, nor did he answer any phone calls that were placed to him. Anyone who had the courage to make a decision or sign any documents did not do so. All of a sudden, there was a frightening void at the center of authority. When it comes to Stalin's mentality during this time period, historians are divided. Certain individuals are of the opinion that he was engaging in a risky game within a circle, observing and waiting to see who would attempt to take control of the situation during this period of turmoil. It is the view of several people that he came dangerously close to having a nervous breakdown. A military defeat was not the only thing that Stalin had to deal with. He also had to deal with the collapse of everything that he had strived for within Russia. After much deliberation, the Politburo finally made their way to Stalin's dacha on the 30th of June. He was still seated in his armchair when they discovered him. He asked them, "Why have you come?" as he glanced up at them, who were looking exhausted and anxious. Although he had suspicions about a coup, the Politburo was not interested in removing Stalin from power. Specifically, they desired for him to return to the Kremlin in order to assume command of the State Defense Committee, which was the cabinet for the Soviet war. In a moment of arguably the greatest vulnerability that Stalin had ever experienced, I begged him, "Can I leave the country to victory? Maybe there are other candidates who are more deserving." Even though it arrived so swiftly, the response, "There's no one even more deserving," with a bow. As Stalin began to gather his nerve, he embraced his new job and began to accept it. In September, Kiev was completely overrun. The advisors to Stalin had pleaded with him to leave the city that was bound. He did not comply, and as a result, over 500,000 people were either slaughtered or taken prisoner as a result of his refusal. Attempting to find someone to blame, Stalin placed the blame on the subjects of the charges. As far as he was concerned, every single prisoner of war was a traitor. In the aftermath of the war, those who had returned were immediately transferred to labor camps. During the time that Raykov's son, who was born to his first marriage, was held captive, Stalin was approached by the Nazis with the concept of exchanging him for some of their own. Stalin merely responded by stating that he did not have a son with that name. Yakov was killed by a gunshot wound. Through the month of October, the Germans had come dangerously near to Moscow. The government relocated in a distance of 500 miles. However, Stalin made the decision to remain. During the 7th of November, when he was attending a parade on Red Square, tanks went past him and onto the front lines, which were located approximately 25 miles outside of the city. The Russian cold began to damage the German forces, and the Soviet men battled with great bravery. When it came down to it, the Nazis were unable to consolidate their victories, and they were gradually defeated by their opponents. A wise alliance was also formed between Stalin and the Allies. During the Tehran meeting in 1943, when Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt all met with one another, there was a reintroduction of Joseph Stalin to the Western world in the form of Uncle Jim. At the end of the conflict, the Soviets had triumphed. Nevertheless, the price was extremely high. There had been more than 25 million deaths in the Soviet Union, which is 6 times as many as there had been in Germany. Stalin made a solemn commitment that he would never again allow Russia to be in such a vulnerable position. At the Yalta Conference, which took place in 1945, the Allies gathered to discuss the world after the war. Stalin made it abundantly apparent that Eastern Europe will continue to be the subject of his authority. On the other hand, the United States of America and Britain were not pleased with Stalin's actions in Eastern Europe. The iconic declaration made by Winston Churchill that an Iron Curtain had been erected across the continent marked the beginning of the Cold War in the United States by Winston Churchill. It was even more popular than it had been before Stalin. The Russian people, who were filled with gratitude, had high hopes that the tremendous victory over Hitler would wipe away the pain of the past. However, despite the fact that the audiences idolized Joseph Stalin, the war had accomplished little more than distracting him and had not altered him in any way. His conviction that everyone was plotting against him was unshakable. There were thousands of returning soldiers who were sentenced to work camps. During Stalin's 70th birthday in 1949, a large number of Jewish intellectuals and doctors were put on trial and executed. Over the city of Moscow, images of the great leader were projected into the ceiling. His all-seeing eye was present everywhere he went. However, he was beginning to feel the effects of old age finally catching up with him. It was on February 28, 1953, during a lavish feast, that Joseph Stalin suffered a stroke that rendered him unable to move. Over the course of the subsequent several days, he began to suffocate to death. On the morning of March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin passed away to his family and friends. The funeral for him was a symphony of sorrow. People in the Soviet Union simply could not fathom living their lives without their God and Father. However, they did it anyhow. Nikita Khrushchev, who would eventually succeed Stalin as leader of the Soviet Union, delivered an unprecedented statement during a closed session of the 20th Party Congress, which took place 3 years after Stalin's death. Although Stalin had been a brilliant leader, he had also perpetrated horrific atrocities against the people of the Soviet Union. According to what he claimed about Stalin, the concept of the benevolence safeguarding comrade leader was eventually unmasked for what it actually was: a horrific falsehood.